So the report lists in the annex illustrative indicators and actions. We'll read them off just to make sure we stay, up to date on what was implied in everything we have discussed in terms of the principles of adaptations or strategies for principles for developing the strategies for adaptation details. So these are the illustrative list of indicators and actions outlined in this guide, and the timelines used is 2020 for baseline, just before COVID became very extensive, global and debilitating. 2025 as the short-term target and 2030 as the medium-term target. I would also like to remind you again that I love these shorter-term decision horizons, because then you can really monitor and evaluate progress and see that you are on the right path. And the climate projections that are used here directly and indirectly are reliable with the model uncertainties out to 2030 and 2040. Beyond that, typically scenario uncertainties tend to dominate, so we have to be careful that the scenarios, which rely on all sorts of assumptions of policies, socioeconomic narratives and stringency of the global warming targets we want to use, which themselves rely on technological promises of carbon capture and sequestration, bioenergy, etc. So these are the good time horizons that I like, my personal opinion. So let's start with the first section, which was on foundations, where we wanted rapid, robust and inclusive development being the first priority. Under it, action F.1 was to focus on increasing economic productivity and growth while keeping buffer for shocks. So here the list indicators and actions: average productivity growth has to be monitored, economic growth, debt to GDP ratio, which is always an indicator of how well the country is managing its monetary, fiscal and economic policies, and structural deficits, which can be a problem if they are not monitored and evaluated, and buffers are set up for shocks, because climate change, especially if it combines with something like an earthquake. Now in Turkey, for example, there was a massive earthquake, and now it's facing severe droughts. So these kind of compound shocks can really create problems if you're living with a structural deficit that can keep limping along, and then can create issues when multiple shocks hit together. Action F.2, ensure that economic growth is inclusive. So here poverty headcount is important. Change in poverty headcounts in the last 5 years is critical to ensure everything is moving in the right direction and that nothing serious is going wrong. Growth in income of the bottom 40% is a good indicator of how people are being moved from below poverty line to above poverty line, which shows how they can be ready with enough resources to adapt to climate change at their local level. Average income of farmers, this is always critical, because in a country like India, for example, it's always said that agriculture only adds about 20 to 25% to the GDP, but it is responsible for 60% of the employment. So it's not just the GDP. So income of the farmers is in some sense indicator of the overall health of the agricultural sector and employment in that sector. Going forward, percentage of farmers with access to fertilizers or improved seeds, which relates to farmers' income as well, and government actions. Average share of household budget spent on food and beverages. This is very critical, because as inflation kicks in and can last for a while, as it has done in the last few years, even in rich countries, people who spend a high percentage of their household GDP on food and beverages can get into trouble when the inflation cannot be controlled easily. Access to modern energy is very important. Number of power outages per year is, it's complicated, because even in a city like Mumbai, if you look carefully at where the power outages happen repeatedly, there seems to be some link to how rich that neighborhood is. So it's this one within one city. So rich people may be protecting themselves better in terms of power outages. Um, Access to improved water, a very good indicator of the Human Development Index. Number of water outages per year can be a serious problem. Access to sanitation can relate to health and productivity. Share of population with a bank account is a good indicator of tracking poverty and moving people above the poverty line, and making sure that the social protection and welfare and help, subsidies, etc., that the government wants to give can actually reach the people with through their bank accounts. Share of population covered by social protection has to be very high for justice and equity in helping with adaptation. Total social protection spending as a percentage of GDP shows how well the government is planning to help people and firms, preparing them for adaptation. Share of population with health coverage, as we said, number of conflict-related deaths in the last year. So these could be internal conflicts or migrants coming from outside, could be conflict that is related to climate change, impact on natural resources, fights for water, etc., and so on. So this is the first section, foundations. Rapid, robust and inclusive development is the first priority. So I'll put this in section 1, and then we'll come back and look at priority area 1, which is to facilitate the adaptation of people and firms. Okay, these will be short, but that's okay, just to keep track of the indices and actions. Okay.